This lecture will look at modern South Asia, independence, and modernization. Our objectives are to review British colonialism in the 1800s, examine the Quit India movement of the early 1900s, and understand the political fragmentation of South Asia and its current challenges. To begin, let's look at the 19th century British Empire. So keep in mind that in the early 1800s, Great Britain, as well as the rest of Europe, was expanding outwards and conquering other parts of the world. Most of their attention was really set here on sub Saharan Africa, as well as South Asia. And then by the late 1800s, they would expand also into Southeast Asia. Now, in the case of the British were already in South Asia. They had started to colonize what is now known as India as early as the 1700s under the efforts of the private company, the British East India Company. And then in the 1800s, South Asia went from basically a private colony of the British East India Company to an actual British crown colony following the Mutiny of 1857, in which the entirety of the subcontinent rose up against the British East India Company for their real heavy handed tactics in government. Trying to suppress Islamic and Hindu religious practices, cutting out local rulers from government, and just in general unwise business practices and government practices that not only led to the Indian uprising, but also at one point led to their near bankruptcy, which resulted in the British Crown having to bail the company out by forcing 13 colonies in North America to purchase tea directly from them. And of course, that ended up being one of the leading contributing causes to the American Revolution. So needless to say, British East India Company had not governed that colony well. So 1857, Great Britain basically took over control, and immediately afterwards they instituted indirect rule. So for much of India's history, colonial history, this was really a place where Great Britain was practicing with giving locals some control of government power, some degree of economic independency. They were allowing for the development of an educated class within this part of the world. And really, when you take a look at British possessions in the 1800s, here on this map, you see that, it's true, as the British used to say, the sun never set on the British Empire. They had a colony in every part of the globe. But the one that the British were most possessive of was this one right here. That was the most valuable jewel in the British crown. And so most of their efforts globally were really with India in mind. So early 1800s, they seized control of South Africa from Napoleon. Late 1800s, they're going to, start to get control of Egypt's finances and their government. And then, they're going to basically fight a protracted war in the late 1890s here in South Africa, which was known as the Boer War. They're going to begin to expand into what is known as Bechuanaland, and then later on into the colonies of Rhodesia, all for the sole purpose of trying to create a railroad to link what they called the Cape to Cairo. And why did they want this massive railroad? Well, for one basic purpose, to facilitate transportation to India. But then in 1867, another construction project by the French made this pretty much this effort. It was still the Cape to Cairo Railroad was still important, but not as important because in 1867, a British construction firm built the Suez Canal. And so from that point on, this was going to be Great Britain's major link to India right here. So 1877, there was this big big to do in Great Britain, this big festival known as the Diamond Jubilee, in which 1877 was declared the Empress of India, and India officially became known as the Jewel of the Crown. So it really kind of shows just how important India was to the British. And Indians themselves were very important because they actually helped the British to expand their empire. So there's a region in India known as the Punjab right here, where most of the population belonged to a group of people known as Sikhs, and the British viewed them as a very militaristic, very militarily capable people. And so, one thing that the British did with their military is they recruited a lot of Sikhs, and Sikhs were used as military units throughout portions of Africa and other parts of the British Empire. Just vital to the British Empire in a number of ways. So from 1914 to 1918, the British, they're going to end up fighting World War One. The British were mostly active over here in what was known as the Western Front. But even while they're fighting there in the Western Front, who were they relying on? Well, they're coming over here to India and they're trying to take all these Indian soldiers, and conscripting them and having them fight in World War One. They would fight. The British fought this major campaign. It was a disastrous one known as the Battle of Gallipoli against the Turks right here. Again, Indians are going to be present there as well as Australians and other colonial subjects. So India, over 1 million Indians are going to end up serving in the World War One, even though it's not really a war of their choosing, much less a war to benefit them. It was a war really of, for British interests. And then what happens after World War One? Well, 1939, 1945, there's World War Two. And so once again, the British Crown calls on the Indians to fight. Only this time, it's not going to be the battlefields of Europe necessarily, although they will fight there. It's really going to be against the Japanese Empire, which just basically explodes out into the Pacific. The Japanese were threatening Australia. They were penetrating deep into North and coastal China. And then they invaded Southeast Asia and began to make a beeline straight for the prized possession of the British Crown, which was India. And so what did the British do? Well, they conscripted Indians to once again fight, this time in Burma. They also brought them overseas to Europe to fight. They were going to be used to, support British positions throughout Africa. And, World War II, it was a pretty nasty conflict. World War One talking about 30 million dead. World War Two, it's 60 million dead. And, here again, the Indians are in the middle of it. And this is really leading to, it's a major contributing factor to South Asian unrest with British rule. So Indians were never, 100% behind being controlled by the British. Although they did view a connection with Great Britain as having a number of economic benefits and some military benefits, keep in mind in indirect rule, the way that indirect rule works is that you basically have the British, and so British right here, the UK, them and all of their colonial administrators and their military people that are basically always going to be in a position that's higher than South Asians. So South Asians are always going to take their orders from the British. And the South Asians were never going to be allowed to be completely equal with the British. So as early as 1885, for example, South Asians had started to organize against British control by forming the Indian National Congress. And this was a political organization that basically fought not necessarily for independence, but really for equality. They wanted representation in Parliament. They wanted to be able to pass their own laws. They wanted to have social equality with the British, especially in their own homeland. And there were a number of people that got involved with this. So Mohandas Gandhi, later on given the title Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they all kind of cut their teeth, if you will, on the Indian National Congress. And again, this is really the big thing. So some examples of just how far inequality lasted. Today, there are two sports, rugby and soccer, that are really big in this part of the world. soccer especially is very popular globally. Another sport that's really played down here in India even today is cricket. It's a sport that's similar to baseball. These leagues were actually uh, restricted only to British subject to British citizens. So Indians, for example, weren't allowed to actually play these sports. And so they're going to have a big fight just to be able to have equality here. So just as Jackie Robinson, for example, good old number 42, was the one to break down racial barriers in American baseball. Indians themselves are fighting to break down barriers in sports overseas. So another good example of how much this inequality lasted is a guy by the name of Mahatma Gandhi. Mohandas Gandhi began his career as a young lawyer, and his big moment with British inequality came when he was working in South Africa, not even South Asia, South Africa. And while he was there, he purchased a first class ticket on a railroad. And when he boarded, he was told by the conductor that he had to sit in one of the back cars because first class was reserved for whites only. And so Mahatma Gandhi, starts to realize that this racial inequality, it really existed beyond India. It was everywhere that the British were. And so this really began his role in fighting the British, the inequality in the British system. So the Indian National Congress, this was the major organization that fought against this inequality. But in 1906 and 1909, another organization formed, and this was the All Muslim League. And it was headed by this guy right here, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Basically, when you look at India or South Asia was a largely Hindu practicing subcontinent. But since the expansion of the Delhi Sultanate around 1000 CE into northern India, Islam had been expanding, but Muslims were a minority, and they were mostly found in what became known after independence as East Pakistan and West Pakistan, these regions. And Muslims were nervous that in the event of independence, or at least self-government, that their voices would be drowned out by the Hindu voices. So the All-Muslim League was designed to basically represent them. So World War I comes around, what happens? Well, this is when the Quit India movement officially begins. As I said earlier, the big issue that they had been fighting for was equality. But going into World War I, Indians began to believe that they would never have true equality with the British, and that what they needed really was this right here, independence. And what really, locked this down as a goal following World War I was the Amritsar massacre of 1919, which occurred on, up here close to the modern day Pakistani Indian border. And what happened is you had a protest against, British policy that ended up with a British garrison opening fire on unarmed Indian protesters. And so the Amritsar massacre, this is like their big pivotal, moment, if you will, that symbolizes that, independence is an absolute must. So from 1919 to 1947, Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they go out and they really, lead the people. There's a lot of activists that are involved in this, but, they're the ones that are really leading the Indians in a campaign of nonviolent resistance. So a policy of nonviolence. And so the idea is that they would, protest in the streets, they would march, they would do everything, but they wouldn't pick up weapons and fight. knowing full well that the British, they would use military forces to try to put them down, and so they're basically taking the violence of the British and turning it against them. So there are a number of different activities they involved, including marching to the sea to harvest sea salt, something that British didn't let Indians do as a way of getting money from the Indians by forcing them to to purchase British salt at a higher price. And so all of this basically results in almost 20 some odd years of nonviolent resistance until finally the British are forced to accept that Indian and Pakistani independence is going to be a thing. They can't stop it. Especially after World War II, when the Indians and the British, the Indians fought so hard for the British against the forces of fascism, against the Japanese and against the Germans. So going into 1946, it's finally decided that yes, the Indians will be given. The British finally decided that they would give Indians independence. The only thing is that they didn't really know what or how they would grant independence. You had on the one side the Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah that wanted what was known as partition. They wanted lands set aside for Muslims and lands set aside for Hindus. Gandhi, on the other hand, believed in a truly unified India, and so did Nehru, and so they fought for a whole India of all Muslims and all Hindus, with a government that would guarantee the right to practice your religion. Eventually, though, the All-Muslim League voice won out the argument, and what happened was, really the shame of the British, is that there was this very hasty partitioning or dividing up of the lands. The British basically in late 46, early 47 said, okay, we're going to divide y'all up roughly here on the Indus River. We're going to cut out this chunk right here for you in what is modern-day Bangladesh, what was known then as East Pakistan. And then we're going to hand over the reins to you, and you can oversee partition. And it was the worst decision that the British could possibly have made. Not sticking around to try to help and try to organize this. Because what basically happens is in 1947, you have this massive flow of Hindus going in this direction. And then you have this massive flow of Muslims going in the opposite direction. And you don't have any, neutral third party overseeing this process. And, keep in mind that there have been some divisions within South Asian society before, especially along religious lines. And so it's at this point that a lot of religious scores are finally settled. And it's just conflict after conflict after conflict by armed bands and this religious group against that religious group. And in the process of, this mass migration in one of the most densely populated parts of the world, millions of people end up dying as a result of it. It's horrific. And then to make matters worse, not all of the land was fully agreed on. So one area, which is known as Kashmir, for example, is comprised of a lot of this territory up here. And it was governed by different princes, it was treated as something somewhat separate. And you had three different people that were laying claim to it. You had the Chinese, you had the Indians, and you had the Pakistanis. Well, no one fully came up with a conclusive decision on who owned what. Because of a lot of uncertainty in how the maps were drawn. All three had legitimate claims to it. And so from 1947 until today, you still have three different nations with three different armed forces, all three of which are nuclear powers, sitting in this tinder box. And one of the biggest concerns in this part of the world is if something bad happens, if people start shooting at each other, could it end up, involving a conflict with two of the most populated populations in the world, in three different nuclear militaries. So you have all of these problems, and then let's just add to that. 1948, Mahatma Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, two guys on two different sides of how independence should happen. They both die, and this is important because Gandhi was he was an icon by this time of nonviolence, and Jinnah was also a voice of reason. And these two guys, even though they were divided over partition, they could still agree to talk and to hash things out. And when they died, it's like those voices of reason, died with them. So today, you still have bitterly divided India and Pakistan. So this is its own country. This is Bangladesh now. But today you'll still have, military checkpoints along the borders of India and Pakistan where they have these elaborate displays of the changing the guard to show just how much they still dislike each other. So what are some modern issues? Well, one of the biggest modern issues today continues to be the conflict in Kashmir, trying to resolve this chunk of land right there. You still have a major India-Pakistani rivalry today. And keep in mind, nuclear power, nuclear power, nuclear power. This is also a part of the world where there is a lot of poverty. So an example of just how impoverished some of these sections are. You have a slum city, as it's called, a city that's made up of makeshift houses. Doesn't necessarily even have like running water and sewage in some parts of it. Just outside of Mumbai, which is located right here, known as Dharavi, and Dharavi's population is over 1 million people living in abject poverty. So economic development in this part of the world is considered crucial. They've been working really hard to attract industry to this part of the world. So, foreign industrial companies are setting up, for example, along the coast of India. Bangladesh today, if you own a pair of clothes, which all of us do, well, guess what? One of them was probably sewn in a sweatshop in Bangladesh somewhere. All the major brands of clothing industry like to send uh, their factory, their production overseas to here. And the reason why is there's not high pay to these people. There aren't any worker protections. And this resulted in around 2014, 2015 with a factory fire that ended up with over 1,500 injuries and a lot of deaths. One thing, though, about India and Pakistan, though, highly educated populations exist here, so they do have a good university and school system to help with this. And China has also started the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're trying to basically link the infrastructure of this, whole part right here, all these countries in South Asia with their own. So there's investment here from all sorts of different foreign countries. Of course, one of the big things with developing a country is women's rights. If you neglect half your population, you are not going to have a fully developed economy. So there's a lot of interest in women's rights. And this is important, out here in Pakistan and some of these northern provinces, especially the ones that border Afghanistan, where there's a Taliban presence. There's still a lag between women's education and men's education. Today, India is suffering from gender violence on a massive scale that's causing a lot of, big street protests against the Indian government. One example of some of the type of violence that women face are what are called dowry deaths. So dowries used to be practiced in Western states. When a female got married, she took with her a dowry or some money into the marriage. This is still widely practiced in India. And sometimes what will happen is if the bride's family does not give enough money to the groom's family, then the groom's family will actually kill the newlywed bride. So, just stopping violence against women and guaranteeing equal education among women is a big policy for all of these countries today. And, they are making some gains in those areas. One way that they're doing this, promoting the development of women is through microloans. This is a new program where nonprofit organizations are giving small little sums of money to women. And the idea is, don't give them like multi-thousand dollars worth of loans. Go to women that say are street vendors and give them just, a little bit of money that they can use to set up their own, shop selling whatever it is that they sell on the streets. And it's enough money to where it gets them started, but that they can also pay it back easily. And so, like this lady right here, what will she do? She'll go out, she'll borrow some money from the nonprofit, she'll start her own vending machine, her own business, and then she'll pay the money back. And then what does she do? Well, she knows somebody else that wants to start her own business. And so she will sponsor her to get a microloan. And then she'll be the one to kind of, oversee the repayment of it, prompting her friend to make payments on time. And then what happens? Well, these two women know a woman that wants to go into business on her own, so they sponsor her. And it's this idea of starting with small groups and just exponentially growing with the number of women that you're impacting, and they've been very successful. The final issue that they're facing in South Asia, of course, is related to the environment. So pollution from industrialization, climate change, and intensified storms. South Asia during the summer, this is the time period where you get the much needed monsoon rains. These are those major storms that blow in here from the south. And again, they bring much, much, much needed water to the subcontinent because during winter, the winds come in from the north and the Himalayas block a lot of the moisture trying to get into India. So the monsoons are good, except for the fact that sometimes they result in cyclones, what are basically known as, the word used for hurricanes down here in the South Pacific, in the Indian Ocean. And especially with like Bangladesh, for example, which has a really low latitude and a lot of rivers coming in here on the Ganges Delta, this can cause a lot of problems with flooding and the damage from high winds. Of course, sometimes tsunamis are created in this part of the world as well as a result of underwater hurricanes. So they do struggle with environmental catastrophes as well. So today, this is South Asia. It started off in the 1800s as a colony, a very important colony of the British. They fought hard for their independence in the 1940s. Today, are they the richest part of the world? No. But, some of these countries like India are making some really great strides in economic development. And so today, investors around the world, policymakers around the world, when they look at South Asia, they look at it as a region of the world that holds a lot of promise for the future.